Welcome back. We have come now to the end of our second week. This is July 8th, 2016, and today we wrap up the first part of this course before the midterm exam with two chapters about the great poet named Homer. The ironic thing is that we don't even really know for sure whether Homer was a real person. There's even sometimes been talk that it might have been a woman writing. The difficulty is that Homer's name in Greek, Homeros, means slave. So it's possible that these works written by him are actually being ascribed to a slave, and that it's possible that through later confusion, the name given to him was in fact Homer. So we're not exactly certain, but since we have nothing else to go on, we simply give him the name Homer. So Homer would date approximately the same time as the author you read previously, Hesiod. Both of them date to somewhere between 800 and 700 BC. And as we talked about with Hesiod, Homer represents a further Eastern tradition. So from your direction, this would be Homer. And on the other hand, this would be Hesiod. So Homer is this way, to the east. So much of what we hear about in stories other than Homer's suggests that many of the tales told, including those surrounding the war at Troy, have some type of Eastern or island-based tradition associated with them. Now, before talking about Homer himself, I want to discuss a little bit about epic, because epic is a specific genre of Greek poetry, which we see shown as an example with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Epic refers to very long poetry, at least 10,000 lines long on average. In fact, the Odyssey is about 10,000, the Iliad is about 12,000. Actually, as epics go, that's rather short, because if you go to the Indian epics in Sanskrit, you have the Mahabharata and you have the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is at least 100,000 lines long a verse, at least 10 times as long as the Odyssey. So these are much, much, much shorter, much easier to read. They don't take nearly as long to read as those. Okay, so epic in any event is lengthy, that's its point, as opposed to later poetry in Greek literature that would have been much shorter. We refer to those as lyric poems. So epic is defined by its length and by its subject matter. It's usually something grandiose, some big major event, not little people, but rather the gods are involved, kings are involved, big powerful men, heroes are involved, Achilles, Hector, and so on are involved. And it's usually some major event that's occurred. This sack of Troy was certainly one of the most disruptive wars that happened, the actual loss of an entire city, a relatively wealthy and famous city at that. And so the whole effect of causation, the rather unusual way that Troy was brought down, the hubris that was perhaps shown by harboring the woman Helen in the city of Troy when the Greeks came trying to negotiate to have her released, and so on. All those elements combine to make this war very impressive. And because both the gods and humans are directly involved in it together, the war becomes deserving of a whole series of epic poems about it. So we know that in early Greek history there would have been a series of poems that are known to us now as the epic cycle. And these poems would have narrated the entirety of a specific major tale altogether for us. And there was in fact a Trojan cycle. It actually started with creation. It went through some other earlier stories like the Battle of the Gods and Titans and the story of Oedipus at Thebes and such, but eventually it had several epics all together, including Iliad and Odyssey, that would have narrated the entirety of the Trojan War. So you would have had the judgment of Paris, when Paris the shepherd, son of Priam, king of Troy, selects Aphrodite as more beautiful than Hera and Athena. That comes about because at the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, who were the parents of Achilles, Zeus attempts not to allow Eris, the goddess of strife, to attend that wedding, but Eris crashes the party and throws an apple amongst the guests, which says Calliste in Greek, for the fairest, and all three of these goddesses jump up and say, me, Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. So Zeus tosses the apple off Mount Olympus to try to get rid of it, but it falls at the feet of Paris. The three goddesses, ignoring what Zeus tries to do, rush on down to Paris, and they say, pick me, pick me, pick me. Hera says, I'll give you lots of power. Athena says, I'll give you eternal wisdom. Boring, boring, got all those already. Aphrodite, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world. You will? I'll pick you. And the most beautiful woman in the world is Helen, who is the queen of Sparta and the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta. So that's how the Trojan War essentially starts. Helen is the famous woman that, whose face launched 1,000 ships from Greece to Troy. So the epic cycle would have narrated that, and then the actual episodes that went on in Troy. You have to realize the Iliad, as you read it for today, actually comprises only a couple of weeks in the 9th year of 10 years of fighting. There was certain pivotal incidents that happened with Agamemnon and Achilles, this big quarrel between them that ended up consuming a lot of the Greeks' energy, as you could see. And so Achilles, of course, is sulking in his tent, refusing to fight. Agamemnon's trying to get him back in the battle unsuccessfully, until eventually the only reason why Achilles rejoins is because Hector, aided by the god Apollo, kills Achilles' friend Patroclus, who has gone out into the battle with the Greeks, substituting for Achilles and actually wearing his armor so that he was mistaken for Achilles. So all of this is grandiose stuff, and all of it deserves a lot of attention. And so different poems in the epic cycle would have narrated all those events, would have gone on past to the way that Troy was actually destroyed with the Trojan horse. It would have been brought down, and then all the Greeks would have tried to get home. And of course, they all had a very tough time getting home because of all the various infractions committed in the course of the Trojan War itself. Odysseus took 10 more years to get home, and that's narrated in Odyssey. And then we end the whole Trojan epic with Odysseus' final journey away from Ithaca, as it turns out, at which he actually ends up encountering his other son, Telegonus, in a rather bad way. Telegonus was actually the bastard son of Odysseus and Circe the witch. Odysseus didn't realize that he had a son when he left Circe on her island on his way home from Troy to Ithaca. Okay, so that's epic. The epic cycle would have had these poems that would have narrated all these events. So in reality, when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have to understand that these are parts of a larger cycle of poems that unfortunately we don't have today. We're fortunate to have a grammarian from the 9th century AD who summarizes the contents of these works for us. So therefore we have a fairly good idea of what was written. We do not actually have the works themselves, but at least we have some idea that these would have been events known to the Greeks, and which of course could be narrated or retold in other forms by later Greeks, such as in tragedy or in poetry or in artwork or wherever else it might appear. There's one other feature of epic that's important to note, and that's the meter. It's called dactylic hexameter. It's so called, dactylic refers to a particular beat that goes long, short, short, like that. And hexameter, it means that there are 6 of them. 6. So the whole thing would sound like this. And maybe the reason why you've never heard of it before is that English poets typically don't use it. One exception happens to be Longfellow for his poems, including Hiawatha. A relatively well-known opening line of one of Longfellow's poems goes, "This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks." I suspect that most people would not really want to have to listen to that. The problem is that English is too clunky in the way that it is composed with dactylic hexameter, because it tends to have to stop all the time. Like, this is the forest primeval. It's very uneven and very jerky, so it doesn't flow very smoothly. But Greek and Latin are both very much smoother languages because most of their words end in vowels, and so you can just make the words flow a lot more smoothly together. So the opening of Iliad is Menin Aeda Thea Peliadio Achilleos Ulamanein, which means sing, O goddess of the wrath of Achilles, the destructive wrath. And you just can build in all that energy into that opening line. And you can hear that the Greek flows a lot more smoothly with that particular meter. We now turn at this point to what's called the Homeric question. And this is a very tangled matter in Homeric scholarship about whether Homer actually wrote his works down or whether they were transmitted orally. We actually have, from back in the 1950s, an investigation into this question with Croatian folk songs by a scholar who unfortunately died quite young by the name of Milman Parry, who showed that Croatians were capable of narrating long folk songs by memory. The way they could do that is, you may have noticed probably a lot in your two Homeric works, how often certain phrases get repeated all the time, like swift-footed Achilles, Agamemnon, the son of Atreus, laughter-loving Aphrodite, gray-eyed Athena, white-armed Hera. These are called epithets. And epithets are useful formulae for poets who are trying to memorize long strings of poetry, because it means that they can repeat certain parts of the poetry over and over again. Just for a second, pause your video for a moment. I want you to think of your favorite song, a rap song, a blues song, a rock song, any modern day song that you can think of. Pause your video and just think for a moment what your favorite song is. Okay? Now, I can practically guarantee you that one thing about that song, I don't even know what song you're thinking of, that it makes it good, is that there is some snappy refrain that comes back over and over again and wants to make you rock. Because it comes back over and over and over again. And you can memorize it. And that's probably what's going on with these poems. You get swift-footed Achilles. And so the epithets are also a way to connect with the audience, to make the poem a lot more jingly and fun to listen to. And of course, a very effective bard, especially at some symposium, would be really great at entertaining his audience that way. So that's part of what's going on with the Homeric works. So in reality, we're not exactly certain how much of Homer was written down and how much was transmitted orally, but it is pretty clear that these works were originally meant to be sung, and only later were they put into writing. And most likely, whatever Homer wrote down probably isn't what we now have. Instead, all the works that he must have composed, and maybe were composed later and attributed to him, were eventually combined together into single works. Actually, it's not until Hellenistic times, 300s, 200s, 100s BC, with two scholars at the Alexandrian Library in Egypt, one named Aristophanes, by the way, not the same as the comic playwright I mentioned before, and the other Aristarchus. The two of them got the two works divided up into 24 books of the Iliad and 24 books of the Odyssey. And they also attached some commentary and were able finally to get formalized the text that we now have today as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Even there, though, there are a couple of tangles. For instance, in the Iliad, we actually have reference to a weapon that is iron, which probably is out of place in the earlier Mycenaean world, so therefore that line must have been inserted later. And then there's a problem about the end of the Odyssey. After Odysseus meets Penelope, which is the last thing that you read in your Harris-Plotzner textbook, he actually goes on to reunite with his father Laertes. While he's doing that, all of the families of the dead suitors team up on him in order to gain vengeance against him. Athena, who is so unhappy that Odysseus has to suffer yet again, finally appeals to her father Zeus, can we please put an end to all this? And so at the very end of the Odyssey, the real Odyssey that you didn't have in the textbook, finally we have Odysseus and his party on one side, and over here we have all the suitors' families coming. So they're coming in like this to each other, and suddenly out of the blue, a lightning bolt shows up, and Athena tells both groups of people, stop, don't fight anymore. And they just stop. And that's the end of the epic. Do you like it? Aristarchus and Aristophanes didn't. They actually bracketed off the entirety of the end of Book 23 and Book 24, all of it. And they said, this is not actually a genuine part of the Odyssey. We're going to put it there anyway, because it came down to us that way, but it was their belief that that was actually attached later, that it might have been another poet who wrote a later work, and that it mistakenly got put onto the end of the Odyssey. So maybe the Odyssey really did end with the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope, as you read it in the Harris-Plotzner textbook. In any event, that's a Homeric question. Now there is another question regarding Homer, and that is exactly where originally do all these stories come from? Now, I wonder if anybody observed a few videos ago that I had this phrase, linear B, on the board, and I didn't make it. Did anybody happen to remember that linear B was up on the board and I didn't say anything about it? If you did, superb powers of observation for you. Great job. Linear B was in fact is the name given to the script for the language that appears to have been spoken by the Mycenaeans. We have a few examples of it in writing surviving because of some palaces around the Mycenaean world that were burned. Most notably, one at a place called Pylos, which is way out in the southwest corner of the Peloponnesian Peninsula in Greece. And from Linear B text, we can tell that many of the gods that we now know as the Olympian gods were also mentioned by the Mycenaeans. So it's very likely that stories about Troy could very well have survived the Mycenaean world and gotten down through the Dark Ages into the eventual Greek times. And so Homer probably was drawing from some of those sources from these Linear B texts or from people who knew what their content was and told them orally, and eventually composed parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey that way. So there is a very frail connection between the original Mycenaean world and the later world post-Troy and post-Mycenae that Homer lives in when he composes the two epic works. And that the frail connection that we have is this script Linear B. Incidentally, Linear B was not always thought in much earlier days as being an actual Greek script. It was thought to be something Eastern. It was a graduate student named Michael Ventris, with the help of some other of his students, including some women students, who compiled the evidence for Linear B and actually wrote a dissertation in which he claimed that Linear B was actually Greek. He used syllables like watar and rapodes to show that it was actually water and tripod, that it was in fact something Indo-European. And it took a long time for many scholars to accept this, and unfortunately he, like Milman Parry, died quite young, and it was not until after his death that his work was verified as correct, and it was discovered, probably to the embarrassment of many scholars who had written to the contrary, that in fact Linear B was actually a script representing an early form of Greek. So we have that connection. Much more than that we really can't do much with, since we do not have any real literary writings from the Mycenaeans. We regrettably just do not know exactly what stories were conveyed from them down to the Trojans, but given about the Trojans to the Greeks. But given that we have some kind of a connection, it is tantalizing to think that maybe Homer was actually able to draw on genuine Mycenaean stories in composing the works. It would be nice to know more, and we just unfortunately do not have enough information to be able to tell. So the Iliad is the 9th year of the Trojan War. It's the big conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles over the fate of Achilles' woman Briseis. That comes about because Agamemnon leads a raiding party into Thrace, which is the region northwest of Troy, seizes a woman named Chryseis, who is the daughter of a priest of Apollo, Chryses, and when that priest prays to Apollo, and then also appeals to Agamemnon for the ransoming of his daughter, Agamemnon refuses, and then Apollo comes down and takes arrows and shoots one arrow of plague after another all through the Greek army, scaring everybody to death and killing a lot of people. And so Agamemnon is compelled to relinquish this woman, but when Achilles holds him to charge for having refused to lead the Greeks correctly, Agamemnon gets his back up and says, well, now, wait a minute. Why should I have to be here without a nice woman in my possession? Why don't I take your woman away? And so he does. And Agamemnon is, Achilles rather, is very, very angry. And that's why he sulks in his tent and refuses to help, and many Greeks get killed in the subsequent part of the Trojan War, until eventually, as we said before, Achilles comes back into the battle to duel Hector, kill him, and drag his body around his tomb in punishment for, the tomb of Patroclus, his friend Patroclus, as punishment for the way that Hector killed Achilles' friend Patroclus. So all of that is built into the Iliad, the 9th year of the Trojan War, and this major conflict that goes on in the Greek camp all the time. Then you have Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus' voyage home. Ironically, the part of the book that actually narrates the tales isn't really the actual voyage. It's Odysseus' narration of that tale to the Phaeacians, who live on an island that's now actually Corfu. It's along the west coast of the northern section of Greece. It was later called Corcyra in ancient Greek times. And so Odysseus is narrating those stories to the Phaeacians, and eventually the Phaeacians help him to get home by sailing him home on a raft, and he drifts southward down to Ithaca. So Odysseus stays faithful to Penelope, if not in body, at least in mind, and eventually does arrive home 20 years later to his beloved Penelope. It's quite a touching tale, and it's in fact really the only hero story that we have of a hero who does suffer for that long in the interest of getting home specifically in order to find his beloved wife there waiting for him. In reality, I'll conclude with this, in order to be a hero in the ancient Greek world, it was necessary for you to have a home to return to. You might accomplish many great things, but if you are a man without a country, you really have no proper place in the Greek world. So Homer is able to get Odysseus home to his wife Penelope in Odyssey. And truly among all the Greek heroes that we read about in ancient Greek mythology, that is one of the greatest accomplishments that any of them manages to achieve. At this point, we are now going to conclude the first portion of this course. On next Monday and Tuesday, we have our review session for the midterm exam, and then on Tuesday, we'll have the midterm exam itself. So you have a brief video waiting for you on Monday that will just quickly go through points about the midterm exam. You can study for it on Monday, and then you will take it on Tuesday. So thanks so much. I will see you back here on Monday to review with you the midterm exam. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday.